joining from. Wonderful. Thank you, Janet, for the message on Zoom. How are you bearing up? It's been a wonderful but busy week, and I hear how husky you have become. Thanks, Janet. I won't take offense at that. It's been a long week, but it's been a fantastic event, and we have been really happy to have so many people joining in across the different platforms from around the world. I know there's been a lot of interest in this. And for us as Island Innovation, it's funny because this time last year, we were explaining to people what Zoom is, because people, we started this event as a virtual conference because we could see the benefit of being virtual. I mean, I think for the types of people we're bringing together, this conference would not be able to exist as a physical event. We've had people from the Seychelles, from Indonesia, from Japan, from the Arctic, from Patagonia, Galapagos, Caribbean, across the Pacific, some of the world's remotest islands. In fact, we had several physical streamings of this event happening in St. Helena, the world's most remote island, halfway between Angola and Brazil, where people got together in the community college to watch the event in person, because thankfully they are still COVID-free there, and we're able to. So this event would not be something that will be possible as a physical event. And so for me, it's exciting to be able to do something in this virtual space and see my thesis from last year that that virtual events can fill an exciting space has now obviously become somewhat mainstream. And who knows where we'll be in the next few years, but I do think that there's an opportunity, an exciting opportunity for virtual events to continue. And I'm sure that will look very different in a year's time than it does right now. So this event really came about because we wanted the opportunity to share information, to bring together collaboration, as I said, in a way that would be difficult physically. We wanted this virtual opportunity to bring together not just the people who can afford to fly halfway across the world to attend a climate change conference or a sustainable development event, but people who are on the ground working and maybe can't make that trip. And so what I think one of the benefits that we've seen at this event has been that virtual events can be more inclusive. Part of that is obviously the distance, as I've mentioned, the geographical nature of who is joining, but also people who maybe are working a full-time job could not attend the physical event. Maybe people who've got kids and can't get off work to be able to travel. There's a lot of different people who've attended this who would be unlikely to have come in person. And so just quickly before I introduce our speaker, Island Innovation, since we've launched this and launched dozens of webinars over the past few years, we have been working with various companies this year to help them move their physical events into the virtual space. And obviously that has been one of the primary things this year. In March, a lot of people had big conferences planned and they wanted to figure out how to actually change. And so the focus this year has really been events in the physical space moving into the virtual space. And we've been working, some of you might have attended the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund's week a few weeks ago, where we helped them. Unfortunately, it was going to be in the Bahamas. Bahamas was closed to travel, and we took that entirely virtual with them and had a great experience. And so Jordan Schwartz from Pathable has been thinking about this a lot, of course, as a company that started primarily to focus on physical events and facilitate physical events. They've had an amazing journey so far this year, and they have kindly been a sponsor of the Virtual Island Summit and provided us with use of their system, which compared to last year, where we had a series of Zoom calls, allowed for attendees to interact in a much deeper way, and also make sure that people could continue to easily view the recordings, comment, and talk to each other after specific individual sessions have started. We've noticed that we've had far more people watching the recordings of the sessions than we actually have attending the live ones, and partly that's due to the global nature of what we're doing. And so some of those Pathable features have come in useful. So Jordan, maybe just to start with you and tell us a little bit about Pathable and your year so far.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, James. Happy to kind of share the journey. Just a little bit of background. So uh, before I founded Pathable 12 years ago, I guess, I was at Microsoft. And I had been at Microsoft for about 10 years, leading teams in the development of social software and kind of leading some innovation teams where we were trying to reinvent uh, the operating system or reinvent the way people communicate. And I would go to conferences, and it was always, I was excited to go in the beginning because I felt like this was an opportunity for me to meet other people who were changing the world. I mean, you can think what you want of Microsoft, but at the time, it certainly felt like I could have a big impact. Um, and it was always just such a disappointment because I would arrive at these events and there would be a big networking reception. There's these talks, and I would get, I don't know, one drink ticket too many, and I would be standing in line at the buffet trying to figure out who I was supposed to talk to. And it was it was a wasted opportunity because I knew that somewhere in those 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people that were in that room, there was somebody that I really should be talking to, that I could, it could be a colleague, could be a collaborator. Um, and so when I left Microsoft, I was recruited by some friends of mine who had started uh, a prototyping what became Pathable. And at the time, this was before there were mobile apps at all. If you wanted an app on your phone, you essentially had to be Apple. There was no app store. Um, but we saw Pathable as a private social network for events, a way for people to connect before an event, start talking to each other, find the people they wanted to meet, and then so that when they were on site, they would be able to have more valuable conversations and kind of target the right people. We even made these name badges that had a list of 6 things to talk to me about, 3 people for me to meet, and then my nemesis. And then that was, nemesis was like the person that was most opposite from you. You definitely did not want to talk to that person. And so of course, what did people do? They ran around the event. They're like, who's this guy? If I touch him, we both blow up. Um, there's a lot of fun. So the things evolved over time. Mobile became a big deal. As a company, we pivoted into the mobile space. We found more and more of our clients saying that they wanted a mobile app for their event. And we would say, oh, well, we have a social network for an event and we built a mobile app that goes with it. And they would kind of wave us off and say, well, that social network part is interesting, but really I need a mobile app. Felt kind of the tail was wagging the dog, and we pivoted into mobile. But that idea of networking and the before, during, and after experience for an event was just always part of our DNA. And so fast forward to COVID, when suddenly the people couldn't be there together, and many of our mobile app competitors didn't really have anything for that before and after. I mean, the desktop experience. And because building relationships throughout the conference experience had always been part of what we were doing, we already had the infrastructure. We had what you've seen, this desktop website with an agenda and the ability to book one-on-one meetings with people and look at their profiles and a trade show component. And we had a few of our customers at that point had leveraged that into a hybrid experience where they had just almost on their own taken Zoom and dropped it in to the desktop website so that people who weren't able to attend the in-person events could watch the broadcast. And so it's funny, I was digging around in our internal Slack channels the other day, trying to figure out exactly what the timeline was. And I found this note that I had written to my team, and right at the end of February, I think it's February 29th of this year, saying, guys, I think that in-person events are not going to come back for 2 or 3 months. And so we got to start thinking about that. Um, so, I'd like to say that I was prescient, but obviously I was um, substandard prescient. But we kind of quickly looked around and we found Zoom technology, and also looked at Vimeo Live and YouTube Live and some of the other technologies, and we're able to very rapidly integrate that into our experience so that we could use this existing um, the existing platform, but make it available to people uh, in a purely virtual way. So you can still watch the sessions. And the way that we had been thinking about it initially, I think really because we were in such a hurry, was we looked at in-person events and we said, okay, well, let's just understand, why do people go to in-person events, and how can we meet each of those goals in the virtual world? So we broke it down. Is education. And so this is, people are going to in-person events to learn something. They file into the room. They're all sitting in chairs. They're looking up at the speaker on stage behind a podium. They've got a screen behind them where they're projecting graphs or whatever, their PowerPoint, and they're dutifully reading the PowerPoint word for word and then going on to the next slide. Hopefully not. And so we said, okay, well, we can do that. That sounds a lot like a Zoom webinar, right? You got the screen behind them with the screen share. You got the person at the podium. We got the webcam. You got a panel. Zoom can do that. We're done. So we take Zoom and we'll take the educational component and turn it into these webinars. But at least for me, I told you in the beginning why I went to events, and it was for the networking. Right? It was those hallway conversations, those lunch table conversations, the conversations late night in the hotel bar after the after the trade show's over and everybody's just kind of unwinding, the networking receptions. And we as a company had always place this high value on relationships. It's kind of said in the beginning, that's why we got started, is to try to solve that problem. So again, okay, if people are going to in-person events to network and to build relationships, how do we replicate that in the virtual world? Well, we've got Zoom meetings, and so we took this idea of I don't know, James, have you ever been to an event where they have those lunch table topics and you get set at a particular table depending on your interest?
Yeah, exactly. We've been trying to figure out how best to facilitate that type of thing in this virtual space.
Right. So we call those birds of a feather, and it's birds of a feather meeting. It's essentially, it's a Zoom meeting. It's you get 10, 20 people into a meeting together, and unlike the educational experience where it's lean back, only the speaker can be seen or heard, these are Zoom meetings where I can see you, you can see me, and we can all talk together. And there's different models for it. You can have a free-form birds of a feather meeting where everybody's just talking and about whatever topic they gathered on, and we allowed people to put multiple of these on the schedule, so you could have a economics or climate change birds of a feather, and then someone else who wants to talk about rising sea levels specifically. I'm kind of sticking with your themes here. Or you can have them more directed. So it's maybe a round table where there's still a speaker who will direct the conversation. It's not so freeform, but the mode is still very much people talking to each other.
Well, I think that's a really good point that you raised there is facilitation, because as any platform, there's only so much you can do as technology. You still have to figure out, as an event organizer, we still say, okay, well, if you, and it will be the same in person. If you throw a load of people in the room and say, do something, then people don't necessarily know. So even what we found is, regardless of the platform that we're using, we need to make sure to pay careful attention to how we give instructions to people, how we then get them to do something in a room. But when that is done right, when you have the match of technology with facilitation, then we've seen this week that you can get some really special interactions that wouldn't be happening in a physical space. In this case, it's because of the sheer distances of people joining. And we had well, it was actually one of our virtual expo sessions where we had people join in our group, and we had someone from the Marshall Islands, someone from St. Lucia, someone from Iceland, and someone from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in India, all joining in to our session, asking us questions, joining that expo. So yeah, one example, but it allows you to do things differently in that sense. I had one question just to touch on something that someone has asked, Nicholas Watts has asked in the chat, and you kind of alluded to. Obviously, you have integrated Pathable with Zoom, and that can be a bit confusing to some people because they say, well, is it Zoom or is it Pathable? You have two platforms. And me and you understand that. It would be difficult for you to recreate Zoom itself, but maybe you can just explain why that is and how that works in terms of bringing those two platforms together.
Yeah, so I think of Pathable as the frame. It's the agenda. It's the directory. It's the venue. Whereas Zoom, for us at least, it's the transport for the audiovisual. It's so if you care about where the technologies begin and end, as you fill in your profile, that's Pathable. As you choose your agenda, that's Pathable. As you go to a page that says what the session will be, and there's that join meeting button, that's all Pathable. And then all we've done, my dev team will jump down my throat if I underplay exactly the feat of this, is we've taken the Zoom player and placed it onto our page, so that's where you actually see the audio and visual parts. We work with actually about a dozen, 2 dozen different alternative audio video systems. We chose Zoom as the primary one, first off, because for many of them, like Vimeo Live or Facebook Live, it's essentially a one-way experience. And that networking experience where we wanted to be able to get people to talk to each other and see each other, that Zoom was really the only and quickest way for us to get there. There's some toolkits where you can build your own video service from scratch, essentially. But we saw things happening very quickly and wanted to move very quickly.
Well, and Zoom is a market leader for a reason. Their quality for videos is great, and they can do a lot of these integrations like you're doing. So no, that makes absolute sense. So I have another question from Ramiro, which I think is relevant to what you were just saying as well. Could it be said that this modality displaced personal encounters? So basically, is this digital avenue is disruptive? It's changing how we think about things. Can working in this virtual space allow us to be more creative?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that notion of disruption is the heart maybe of this talk, this conversation we're having, and speaks to what the future of virtual events will be. COVID, I mean, it's a disaster. I mean, a worldwide, unparalleled disaster. But in some ways, I think of it like that, the asteroid hitting the planet so many years ago, or the Chicago fire that just leveled Chicago. And it was awful for everybody who was there at the time. But in the aftermath of it, well, mammals found a new blank slate on which to evolve, and were able to create a new world based on a new set of assumptions by clearing out the old. And the Chicago fire, at least the way it's said, is that the kind of the tangle of streets and building codes and all ramshackle this, ramshackle that was cleared, and they were able to build this new city without the constraints of the way things used to be. And I think that when I think about the disruption and what that's going to do for how we relate to each other looking forward is really relevant. I mean, another example is if you think about the keyboard on your computer, right? It's that we call it the QWERTY keyboard, and it's QWERTY is the top characters. That's why they call it that. And it's super, I don't know if I'm a pretty good typist, but it's deliberately made to be hard to type on. And the reason is, back before there were computers, before there were even typewriters, when there was kind of these old style typewriters that the manual kind, if the typists moved their fingers too quickly, the keys would get jammed. And so they purposely rearranged the keys so that frequently used keys weren't next to each other, and that would slow the typist down, and it would allow for typing to go unjammed. Well, once that constraint disappeared, people had already learned to type using the old system, and so they didn't really transform the keyboard, and so now we're still stuck with this deliberately inefficient way of typing. And there's some people who have developed new types of keyboards with different arrangements, but it's hard to change once you've got a system. But I think about what the world will be like in post-COVID. So I mean, at some point, whether it's 2021, whether it's 2022, it's a whole other conversation. When we are able to interact in person, but we've had our expectations changed, and we've had new technologies and new solutions have become common, how will that change events? And I mean, I think one thing that to me is clear is that just in talking to Pathable's customers, what we're hearing a lot is people say, I used to have a single event a year, and people would travel from all over. It'd be 3 to 4 days, and I'm not going to do that. Even when I can do it again, I'm not going to. And I think this Island Innovation the event is a great example of why people don't want to return to that old system. Because, and James, you were just talking about this, you had people from all of these different places, from these different islands, all participating from wherever they were. You have people across time zones on different parts of the world participating together. And you couldn't do that if you drew people together, because everyone's got to get on an airplane. They've got to stay in a hotel for some period of time. They're not going to do that for 2 weeks because they've got families.
Yeah, no, and I think obviously one topic that's of great concern to a lot of our participants is climate change as well. And so there is the emissions argument that we've had that a lot of people are concerned about, and particularly a lot of people, if you're working in the climate change space, you feel uncomfortable about flying halfway across the world to go and talk about climate change somewhere. And actually, I'm careful because I do think that there are valuable conversations that have happened. And actually, if you asked me that last year, my argument would be, well, it's kind of a necessary evil to get things done. You have to meet in person. But I think because we've all been forced to think about this, and a lot of people this year have used Zoom for the first time, have engaged in things for the first time, it's been this forced change that has allowed us to do something that's exciting and new. And so I think that now we're in a weird stage because we haven't reached equilibrium yet. We're still in a weird flux where people are not traveling at all. And I do think people are going to want physical events of some sort. We all like that face-to-face interaction, but the way that I think about it, curious if you agree with this, is really that physical events and virtual events are two different things. There's obviously some similarities between them, but they're quite different in terms of what you can accomplish. It is more difficult in some levels to get those kind of more social relationships over a virtual event as much as you try. But at the same time, you can make quick interactions and do a lot of networking that just would not be possible in physical. So I like to think of them as two separate things. I think that next year, the year after, who knows, we'll eventually get to the point where we have a combination of those. People will still be engaging in virtual events, and that will become more mainstream. But equally, there will be some level of going back to physical. And our original plan for this year had been that we were going to have physical hubs taking place around the world. So as I mentioned in the introduction, we only had one of those because there's not that many places without COVID. But hopefully next year, we'll be in a situation where people, whether it's a small community hall in Scotland or someone at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., we have this whole range of people who are preparing to organize screenings and physical sessions based around this. And I've heard about this a lot, this move to hybrid. I am cautious with hybrids because I think that you kind of have the difficulties of both and you can create a lot of work for yourself. But I know you've done hybrid events before, and it's probably not going to be that popular this year, but do you have any thoughts on maybe where that could go or how that could be enabled by technology?
Yeah, I mean, seeing people in person is fundamental to the human experience. And I don't think that Zoom or this kind of two-way video will ever really substitute for it. But I think that as you look at, but there are advantages, right? So again, like you talked about, more people can attend with a lower environmental impact. People can attend with a lower family impact, right? My son's upstairs. I don't have to be away from him for longer than I need to, which is a blessing. And so one of the things that we've been hearing just when it's pure virtual is that many of our clients were afraid that attendance would be down at their event versus the previous in-person events. And what they're finding is the opposite, that actually attendance is up because we've reduced those barriers. But I do believe that when there is just such a carnal desire to see people in person and to, I don't know, to smell them and to pat them on the back and just to get that feeling of rubbing shoulders, literally rubbing shoulders with people in a crowd is, I mean, it's in our DNA for that to have an emotional impact. And so I think that will come back. Now, but there are challenges. So how do you create an event that works for both the remote and the in-person attendee? For the educational sessions where it's that lean back experience, it's pretty simple, right? You got a camera person in the back of the room. Maybe you have a way for the remote people to ask questions. They type on their keyboard, or they can even be projected on the screen, and speaker can turn around and take questions that way, and also take questions from the audience. But the networking piece is harder. How do you create opportunities for people to participate in roundtable conversations? Do you end up with some kind of segregated, we're gonna have our in-person roundtable and then we'll just have a separate group of the remote people? Would that create some kind of two-class system or divisions that aren't healthy? I mean, we are talking to and working with AV companies to look for technology solutions to that. I mean, can you have a Zoom grid of people who are attending remotely, and the people in the room can talk to them and see them? So that's one thing that we're thinking about. I know that there's one event that is recruiting us to be an exhibitor at it, is bought 50 Chromebooks, and they put them in a room, and they're setting up appointments, kind of one-on-one meetings between their in-person participants and the remote participants. Um, so, the in-person participants kind of sit down and they have a place, a little window to look at the remote people. But I keep thinking that there's something more than any of that. I mean, we're still, all of those things are still just taking this analog of the in-person event and finding a way to replicate it online, or to merge it online, but in the same form. And kind of what excites me is thinking about how we can create relationships between people, how we can create connections between people and activities that couldn't happen in person.
And on that point particularly, I've just seen quite a few comments in the chat related to this, because one thing that will resonate with a lot of islanders is that if they want to meet other islanders, they have to go to the big hub. So you have to go to Edinburgh or London or New York, whatever is your hub as a city. And so we actually had one of the members of parliament for the Scottish Islands speaking yesterday, and he made the point of what it's been able to do for him is what he called island to island interactions. So people can stay at home and still make these, and I've used the term digital bridges between islands to connect them in a way that, and of course, by making those actions or connections, by the fact that you needed to go to a center to engage with them previously, it also limited who could do that. It was those that either had the time or resources. I mean, to take an example, for some of the Scottish islands, it can easily take a day, a full day, 24 hours to get to London in some cases, let alone from then London to New York and beyond, or wherever you're going. So you have to have time, you have to have the ability to travel. There's all different reasons, as you mentioned, kids, disabilities, finances, time. There's all these different things that limit you. So it was pointed out in the chat that virtual events can be a bit more, can also be more inclusive. But we are at a stage where there is so much kind of up in the air. There's not really even that many best practices for virtual events. I mean, if you were doing a physical event, you have an idea of who the, what is common practice, what do we engage. We're just about getting there, that now people know that they have to mute their microphones, which even before COVID was still a thing that you had to continually remind people. People have just about got that now. But beyond that, there aren't that many best practices, and we're still figuring that out. And one thing that comes to mind is that the space is very different in terms of, as for me as an event organizer, charging people for tickets is one interesting one. Charging and making a financial decision. I mean, obviously this event is free to attend, but we have a huge cost of running it. And so a big question for us is, how do we actually find ways of financing that? And it does seem that still people are unsure whether to charge for their physical events. Can you charge as much? In general, they do seem to be charging less, but that doesn't actually mean that your costs as an organizer are less. So have you seen, or is it still too early to say maybe, have you seen any trends with your clients and customers on whether they're charging, or perhaps that's not something you get particularly involved in?
We do see them charging. We see the costs are reduced. But I mean, it ought to be the case that the costs are reduced to put this on too. I mean, I know obviously you have, you pay speakers, and there's other costs that go into this. But you compare that to, the renting out the Moscone Center or something like that for 3 days, and the union workers are, setting up the carpets and the drapes, and they got the coffee service at $10 a head for, your hundreds of people, and, $3 cookies for.
I should clarify, of course, it is often cheaper to be a virtual event, but I think people make the assumption that cheaper means free. And there are still, obviously, it's difficult to compare like for like, but there are still the substantial, mostly it's time of people and employees and the technology and everything else. So those things still do have to be covered. But yeah, I understand that point, that
Yeah.
obviously it can be cheaper to do a virtual event.
Yeah, no, we are absolutely seeing people charge for virtual events. It is typically less, which kind of reflecting the lower cost of goods, the cost of producing it. But as long as if you're delivering value to all your constituents, I think that they are not surprised to be paying for that value. Now, sometimes, we have academic conferences or professional organizations or associations where they have to earn continuing education credits. So some requirement to attend an event, to listen to, 4 hours of talks on whatever, and they're required to attend in order to continue their profession. So they're not surprised that they're paying for that. And whether it's online, it's in person, or it's watching renting a recording, they're doing that. I think that the harder piece comes from the exhibitors and the sponsors, and how they get their value, and how one can charge there. I mean, when we would go to trade shows, we'd pay, I don't know, $10,000, $20,000, something like that, for essentially a 10 by 10 square of carpet. And we put up our boards and whatever. And the value for us was people walking in and giving us their cards and being able to have those face-to-face conversations. And that's a lot harder to do online. It's a lot harder to deliver that value.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, we have, that was kind of the third piece of the in-person to virtual analog that I was talking about earlier. We had education, networking, and then trade show is that third piece. And I'll say honestly, I think we have an imperfect solution right now, where we use Zoom rooms, and every exhibitor gets a page that they can customize, and they put their logo up and their description. And then when it's exhibit hours, there's people waiting, the exhibit staff is waiting in a booth, and people can come in and talk to them, and you get leads that way. It doesn't scale particularly well. I mean, it's good for smaller events, but you get big events and you get 100 people all kind of coming through at once, and it's one room. It's kind of chaotic. Right. I'll give you a little glimpse of what we got, how we're trying to solve that, if you're interested.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. And
So,
oh, go on.
Yeah. So, and I will get back to the original question, which is, how charging and kind of what the financial model around the events are. But this is our vision for how the virtual trade shows work in the future, where you're still going to have exhibit staff, but instead of at the time of the trade show saying, I'm going to enter a big room, Zoom meeting essentially, and I'm trying to talk to everyone, there's just a talk now button, and it connects you live with one particular person from the booth. So we'll do a little round robin here. It's going to notice that Dimitri is free. He's not talking to anyone. I want to talk to someone from Amazon about their web services, and I can do that. And then, now I can see him and he can see me, and we're having the same kind of conversation that we might have had in the booth. And so as an exhibitor, I get that, I still get what I want, which is leads, right? I want customers. I want people to talk to. And so that's some of the things that we're doing, trying to improve the value that we offer, so that the event host can fund their event by charging for reselling that value.
Yeah, that's a good, useful point. Creating that value, and you can create a lot of value for sponsors and partners, etc. With those. So, just to pivot slightly to a different point, you said earlier about people currently are taking their physical event model and trying to cram it into a virtual space. That's kind of the stage that we're at right now. And obviously, hopefully beyond that, we find that one thing that we found is obviously you can't expect to have a captive audience in the same way as you would at a physical event. That's a fundamental difference, that if someone has flown across the world or even just driven for an hour to be at your conference for the day or for 4 days, they are much more invested and they're going to be there. And so the way that we've dealt with that is really by deconstructing the model. We have 30 sessions. We're not expecting everyone to attend all 30 sessions, particularly because some of them were at 2, 3 a.m. in the morning for my time, because we have a lot of people in Australia and New Zealand joining. For everyone listening, we do have a team member in California who is running those. Don't worry, I did sleep. But then also a lot of this content will be available on recording, and we know because of the nature of ours that a lot of our audience is watching through those recordings. So any other thoughts on that? How people can kind of, in terms of setting their agenda, what
Yeah.
do you normally advise people in terms of doing that, given that it's unlikely in a lot of situations that people will sit in front of their laptop for 8-10 hours?
Right. Yeah. So we've seen, I would say, three trends that uh, show the divergence of virtual events from in-person events in terms of agenda setting. Number one is the advent of 24-hour or 36-hour events. So we had, I think the Association of Proposal Management Professionals had a 36-hour straight event. Just it followed the sun, and they had some repeat sessions, but it was continuous. And obviously no one attended the whole thing. They slept for the parts they slept, and then they could go back, like you said, and watch the sessions they missed. But I talked to the folks who put it on afterwards, asked them how it went, and they said it was a huge success. But they also sat there scratching their head and saying, we did it that way because we were trying to replicate what we had, which was a 3-day event where everyone would come together from all around the world, and we were constrained because we knew they all had to fly home and we could only get the hotel for a certain amount of time. So what they're planning to do in the future is have more events sprinkled throughout the year. And so it's you can think of it as a year-long event that happens every week or every 3 weeks or once a month, where you don't tax people in the same way you're talking about, where it's 8 hours and oh my God, I can't watch another Zoom meeting, and something's going on outside anyway, and I'm gonna take a break and maybe I'm not gonna come back. You can create that same content and just spread it out over time. And so that's, I said 3 ways. So it's kind of, there's 2 versions of that. One is which you have smaller kind of 4-hour events that happen once a month or twice a month. And then the other is just kind of blowing up the model entirely and falling back a little bit to that webinar style presentation, where there's just one presentation every day or once a week, and people come in for it, but then it's all knit together with a persistent community, an online community. And that's something that is kind of fits in very much with our ethos at Pathable, where we started off by saying we want to create the opportunities for people to have relationships and to get to know each other before the event and after the event. And so if we can use our platform, or other providers can provide platforms where there is a community where people can talk asynchronously, but then come together periodically for live, interactive, I can see your face, you can see my face interactions, then I think it's something that you couldn't do it in person, because it takes a day to get from Edinburgh to whoever, the Maldives. I want to say that those kind of chat rooms and um, even this kind of presentation where the viewers can see your face and my face, but we can't see theirs, is somewhat, it's limiting. I think it is so powerful to be able to look at somebody's face while you're talking to them. And, you get, there's millions of years of evolution that went into our ability to read emotion and to pick up more than the words say, um, when you can see somebody.
Yeah. Well, and I think there that one of my pet hates is people calling virtual events things that are really just a broadcast where there's no audience interaction. So platforms, and we've tried to up that. We really encourage our attendees, even just the chat. I mean, the chat in its own is obviously has its limitations. What I like about Pathable as opposed to a normal Zoom call is that the chat is there before, during, and after. I think it's really limiting on Zoom that you finish your webinar and the chat immediately disappears, which is one of the reasons that we really wanted to use Pathable, to have people comment before, during, and after. And we found that to be really successful, particularly because our audience is so global and a lot of people have been watching have been watching the recordings afterwards. Just a quick point on the interactions. We've had a Network Plus program, which I know some people here have joined in. That was the only paid part of this event that we sold tickets for, and we found that we were able to integrate quite well a program there that people could jump in, talk to each other, and have conversations. So for anyone here, we do straight after the closing session have a final Network Plus program, and we've opened that up to everyone. So that will be 9 p.m. UK time or 4 p.m. New York time. And so would encourage you to join that just to see something that we're now experimenting to see if that can be an ongoing weekly or monthly networking event that will help people still have the option to meet new people. Because I think now we've had 6 months where there's been limited opportunities to meet new people. People are, really using their existing network, but it's still more difficult to go outside that. And I know a lot of people who have, it's obviously on the individual in a summit like this, you have to put yourself out there and really actively message people and reach out to people. And the people who have done that during the summit have found it really, really rewarding. So
Yeah,
Jordan, sorry, go ahead.
if I just want to say, like, I was noticing Arlene in the chat earlier had mentioned that she had attended a virtual training session, and they did a kind of hybrid of the broadcast and networking, where there was a broadcast set part of it, and then people broke off into the interactive networking and then came back together. I don't know if that's kind of what the direction you're heading with this Network Plus, but that's definitely the direction that we're looking to go, to try to create opportunities for personal interactions, even when you have thousands of people, right? And so you have to start trying to find ways where you can take a big group, break it into small enough groups that you can have human to human personal interactions, people can see, can be heard, can, and then, but still offer that at scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we had, separate to this event, we had a Zoom webinar that had around 900 people live there, and the chat became almost unusable because it was just boom, 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 so many messages. And then, on Zoom chat, you can't, for example, click on the person's profile like you can in Pathable and learn something. So then people have a tendency to post their LinkedIn in the chat, but then it disappears. So I bet in a year's time, and I know that Pathable is adding new features and changing things all the time. In a year's time, we're going to be in a completely different space. Things are rapidly evolving to meet this new market, which is exciting. So maybe we can wrap up with any final thoughts on the future for Pathable and for the virtual event space in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think for my closing thoughts, it's really what I was just talking about is probably the most important thing for us, that we're looking for ways to take a 1,000-person event, a 10,000-person event, and still create opportunities within that for small group meetings. So, we have a one-on-one meeting scheduling tool right now where you can pre-schedule a virtual meeting with somebody. That the screenshot I showed you briefly of how we're allowing you to start these instant calls with exhibitors during exhibit hours is another example of that. But we've internally we started experimenting with like a trivia hour where the whole company comes together, or at least we had our US time zone people, and then our European time zone people, and then our Asia Pacific time zone folks came together, and they had this a trivia game, and it was a blast. I mean, people loved it because it gave them an activity to perform together in small groups, right? They had teams, but then they could still interact with the larger group. And I think that that's the kinds of model that we want to enable. I mean, Zoom and Pathable, I really feel it's the clay, it's the canvas. And we're talking to clever producers who are trying to create experiences and looking for ways that we can lend our technology and make it flexible enough so that people who want to not just curate experiences, but really develop new experiences that are free of the old constraints of in-person meetings, and leverage the fact that some people may be in person, but many people are going to be remote. But they still want that same thing that everybody wants, which is human relationships. And so to me, that's exciting. I feel like, I don't know, in some ways I feel like I'm tinkering in Steve Jobs' garage and it's 1972, and like, how are we going to reinvent this world now that there's room for it? We could have been doing hybrid events for a long time. We could have been doing virtual events for a long time. And you were, right? I mean, Bert, you were doing virtual events before it was cool. And there were hybrid events, and there are companies that have been around for years doing it, but there was always this sense among meeting planners, like, I don't know if my people are ready for it. I'm just used to doing it this other way. I don't know if people will show up. I don't want to take the risk.
Right.
Well, that's all gone.
Well, and
Now,
also because people have been forced to use the technology, a lot of people have used this who probably would never have even tried it before, have come into this because they're like, well, they don't have another option. So it's this forced change has had its pros and cons, like everything else. But definitely it's going to be something that is lasting on some level. We can't really predict what it will look like in the future, but as I said, I think in a year's time we'll be looking at a very different landscape in this space, both because I think the attendees will have formalized their expectations a little bit more, and the organizers, I mean, we're going to be going back to this normal, and so now everything's in flux, but we're getting there where there's going to be this kind of solid expectations in a new way. So looking forward to maybe having this conversation in a year's time and seeing where we are then. It could really be a entirely new place.
right. I hope that we won't find that there's one of those statements like, in-person events are probably gone for the next 2 to 3 months.
Yeah, I mean, what things we were saying in March obviously are completely new now. It's difficult to commit over a month, but we're about to go straight into our closing session, which starts in 5 minutes. So for everyone here, I would encourage you to jump over to that new room. There'll be a quick wrap up, only about 15 minutes from me. And then we have musicians, artists joining from St. Lucia, Ireland, Scotland, the Azores, and Hong Kong. I may be missing one as well, but we have global musicians from different islands who will be joining and participating. And then straight after that, after our closing session, we will have our final Network Plus, which we've opened to everyone else. you can get in touch. I guess Jordan or Christina, you can drop some contact details into the Pathable chat. So if people are interested in this platform, they can get in touch with you directly for further information. And yes, thank you so much, Jordan. Really appreciated Pathable being a part of the Virtual Island Summit and allowing people to have some of those networking experiences that you've mentioned.
Thank you, James. It was fun conversation.
Nice chatting. All right. Bye bye,
All right.
everyone.